This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is A Revolutionary for Our Time, The Walter Rodney Story, by Leo Zelig. Walter Rodney was a scholar, working-class militant, and revolutionary from Guyana. Strongly influenced by Marxist ideas and having lived through numerous socialist experiments in the 1960s and 1970s, he remains central to radical pan-Africanist thought. In this book, the first full-length study of Rodney's life, Leo Zelig critically considers Rodney's contribution to Marxist theory and history, and the contemporary significance of his work. As Olufemi Taiwo puts it, through exacting research, exacting presentation, and careful analysis, Leo Zelig offers a remarkable contribution to radical thought and practice worthy of Walter Rodney's legacy. Find A Revolutionary for Our Time at haymarketbooks.org, where readers in the US and UK receive free shipping on orders over $25 or £20, respectively. A Revolutionary for Our Time, The Walter Rodney Story, by Leo Zelig, out now from Haymarket Books. This week's Rerun is my interview with Adom Getachew on her book Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. It's from nearly 3 years ago, October 2019. I'm posting it today because it's August and we're on part-time summer schedule for 2 months. But I'm also posting it today because this episode pairs really well with last week's interview with Kojo Karam on his book Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. Karam exposes colonialism as a vast system of organized plunder and tells the story of decolonization as not just a struggle for independence, but a struggle to remake the entire capitalist world system so that newly sovereign nations on its periphery could exercise real economic power. That decolonial dream was crushed by the neoliberal reaction, which left new nations nominally sovereign on a political level while keeping them firmly subordinated within the capitalist economic order. Karam argues that today, decolonization so often being invoked as a symbolic culture war battlefront obscures both that decolonial history and how the legacy of empire has boomeranged back into the metropole to eviscerate the post-war welfare state. Getachew's brilliant book takes a deep look into how those decolonial struggles were world-making projects, culminating in the proposal for a new international economic order, or NIEO. I'll explain more once I segue into my original introduction to that interview in one moment. But first, please support this podcast at patreon.com/thedig. Think for just one moment how many other podcasts exist where you can find an interview like this one or like the one I conducted with Karam last week. We pay nothing at all, so we depend on your contributions to make that possible. We fund The Dig primarily through listener contributions from those of you who can afford to contribute. That way, we can make all our content free and available to everyone, regardless of your ability to pay. Putting that attempt at moral persuasion aside, contributions also get you our excellent newsletter delivered to your email inbox. Or for larger contributions, we send a book or books, a Dig tote bag, or Dig coffee mug. That's patreon.com/thedig. I am talking to you, the person who keeps meaning to contribute but has not yet done so. Take just one moment and contribute now. We really, really appreciate it. Also, a reminder that I'll be at the Socialism 2022 conference, hosting a live episode of The Dig. In that live episode will be an interview with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Robin D.G. Kelly, and Femi Taiwo on just, the entirety of the present moment and how we got here and where we might be going. It's going to be really good, so please come to Chicago, if you can, September 2nd through 5th. I will also be hosting a screening and discussion of the short documentary When We Fight. It's about the 2019 LA teachers strike by filmmaker Yael Bridge, and I'll be having that discussion with the CTU's Jesse Sharkey. And also, we'll be doing a N+1 sponsored panel on the relationship between intellectual and organizing work with Gabe Wynant, Donna Murch, and Mia Inouye. Lastly, we are going to have a Dig listener happy hour on Sunday, I believe, after the live Dig show. So register now at socialismconference.org. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. The world as we know it wasn't inevitable, but it does often seem that way. And that normalcy is dangerous because it makes the current imbalances of power between rich countries and poor ones seem natural, which they're not. This normalization of an unequal global system has consequences. It allows migration from poor countries to rich ones to be stigmatized as criminal, and the intervention of powerful nations into weak ones to seem justified. The world is divided by nation-states, which gives people the false impression that a country's problems are solely of their own making, and obscures the fact that we live in a world system that was made by colonialism and global capitalism. Overthrowing that system and replacing it with something just is perhaps the most important unfinished business of the 20th century. As my guest, Adom Getachew, explains, anti-colonial leaders from across the Anglophone Black Atlantic didn't just try to cast off European rule. They fought to remake the entire hierarchical global order made by colonialism. They argued that empire was a system that pillaged the colonized world's primary goods for first world profit. Decolonization, then, required that system's total transformation and the construction of an egalitarian global economic order in its place. In 1957, Ghana became the fourth independent black state in the world, joining Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia. In 1945, there were just 51 member states in the United Nations. By 1970, there were 127. Leaders of the decolonizing world, like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Trinidad's Eric Williams, Jamaica's Michael Manley, and Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, followed black anti-colonial radicals like C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and George Padmore, who had identified slavery and the transatlantic slave trade as foundational to not just colonial subjugation, but to the making of the entire capitalist world system that had made race into a pretext for domination. Like the 19th century U.S. labor Republicans I recently discussed with Alex Gorovich, these thinkers and leaders rejected a narrow definition of slavery so as to embrace a radical vision of liberation. Already by the 1970s, however, the wealthy countries of the global north were deftly moving from fighting to maintain direct colonial control to insisting that the global south was out of control. It was the global corollary to the neoliberal assault on the domestic post-war settlement in Europe and the United States. Quickly, the leaders of a now neo-colonial order declared that the anti-colonial alternative was impossible because there was, as Margaret Thatcher put it, simply no alternative. Neoliberalism was ascendant, and the multitude of black nations that had so recently won their independence had their dependence, poverty, authoritarianism, and civil violence rendered ordinary. The global south was, like those oppressed within the global north, cast as having failed on account of their own pathological and atavistic shortcomings. The world we live in wasn't inevitable, and neither is our future. That's the great opportunity. Given the rapid onset of climate change, it's an enormous risk, too. Okay, here's Adom Getachew, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, where she focuses on black political thought and postcolonial theory. She is the author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, from Princeton University Press. Adom Getachew, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Conventionally, decolonization is portrayed like so. Formerly colonized people secure national self-determination by winning control of an independent nation state and casting off alien, usually European, rule. But the history that you piece together throughout the 20th century and across the Anglophone Black Atlantic is a very different one. Radical leaders and intellectuals fought for a form of decolonization that would require transforming the entire world system. To start off, explain your overall argument and how it departs from the conventional wisdom.
Sure. So as you've noted, the traditional or standard account of decolonization has really two pieces. One is this thesis of alien rule, which views empire primarily as a bilateral relationship between a metropolitan power and a colonized periphery. Second, it views the international politics of that bilateral relationship as one of exclusion, so that we imagine that the colony is excluded from international politics and international legal relations. My book starts with the premise that for a variety of anti-colonial nationalists and anti-colonial critics throughout the 20th century, empire was actually a structure of racial hierarchy, of international racial hierarchy. And for them, this meant two things. One, the colony was not excluded from international political and economic relations, but unequally integrated. It was a subordinated part of the international infrastructure. Two, they always thought that alien rule was only one form of imperial power. It didn't have to be the only or the only form, even if that was the dominant form that a variety of anti-colonial nationalists were combating in the period that they were in the period of the 20th century. So this argument that unequal integration and international racial hierarchy meant for them that you couldn't just limit decolonization to securing national independence or national self-determination. You had to undo these structures of international hierarchy, both in their legal, political, and economic manifestations. So the book both tries to show what this thesis of empire as unequal integration makes visible, and especially by looking into the interwar period where Ethiopia and Liberia become, for me, exemplary cases in which we can see how unequal integration operates even in the absence of alien rule. Then the rest of the book looks at three different projects of what I call anti-colonial worldmaking, attempts to transform international political and economic relations. And these are the emergence of a right to self-determination in 1960, the creation of regional federations in the West Indies and in Africa, in the late 1950s and through the early 1960s, and then finally the new international economic order of the 1970s.
Slavery's foundational role in colonialism, in empire, was key to this analysis. And you quote W.E.B. Du Bois, who famously said that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," which, as you put it, was an argument that imperial regimes had globalized Jim Crow. How did the legacies of the racialized institution of chattel slavery come to shape an imperialist project that had initially been conceived of in perhaps more civilizational terms? How did that shift change how colonialists understood and organized colonialism in increasingly racialized terms? And also, importantly, how did the anti-colonial thinkers across the Black Atlantic that you're writing about, like Eric Williams, C.L.R. James, and Du Bois, how did they develop a shared analysis of colonialism's origins, its ongoing nature?
So the story of New World slavery and the transatlantic slave trade plays a number of roles throughout the book. First, it's the case that for these the anti-colonial characters at the center of the book, the New World slavery is the originary moment of the modern world. So this is the site and space in which something like unequal integration is first born out for them. It creates the world system that they are then embedded in and combating into the 20th century. So, of course, that is a story of...
And it not only creates that world system, but there's no world system before.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And I think, we can talk about this later as well, but the idea of anti-colonial nationalism as a project of world-making comes from the perspective also that empire itself was a world-making project, right? It made a world of deep forms of hierarchy and unequal integration. And it's against this backdrop of imperial world-making that anti-colonial nationalists were intervening. So, but that story of slavery as a foundational moment in the world order is a story of kind of deep historical continuity. And against that backdrop, I try to highlight a story that's really focused on the late 19th and early 20th century. And here it's a post-emancipation story about how ideas of naturalized racial difference actually emerge after the end of New World slavery. And here I draw on the work of Thomas Holt, Saidiya Hartman, and others. And what they illuminate for us is that when projects of incorporation and extension of citizenship to formerly enslaved people failed, what develops in the aftermath of that is a new forms of racialized coercion that actually reinforce the idea of racial difference, that naturalize the character of racial difference. In this late 19th century moment, this account of deep racial difference would get incorporated, expanded, and extended into European imperial expansion into the African continent. So here, a really important reference for me is Andrew Zimmerman's book, Alabama and Africa, which traces how the German Empire in Togo would try to extend the model of the new Jim Crow South into their African empire by partnering with Booker T. Washington and the Tuskegee Institute, and had an imagination of Togolese colonial subjects as ideal cotton cultivators, growing out of, again, this effort to globalize the Jim Crow South. I think alongside this, so Du Bois has this line where he says, the discovery of whiteness, of personal whiteness, is a new fact in the world. It's in late 19th and 20th century matter. And I think what he has in mind here is about a kind of newly resurgent ideas of Anglo-Saxonism, of white civilization. We see this in projects around Greater Britain, this project of imperial federation that's really focused on the settler states, Australia, South Africa, although ambivalently, and Canada, New Zealand, as part of this vision of Greater Britain. So in this period of the late 19th century, then you see a kind of racial, like a hardened color line that's simultaneous, that's also globalized at the same time. And I think this is what Du Bois means by when he says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the global color line.
And then how did that shape more broadly these thinkers across the Black Atlantic like Williams, James, Du Bois, others, in terms of their shared analysis of colonialism's origins? How did that inform their thinking about its ongoing nature and how it might be overcome?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the things the book tries to show is that in the interwar period, there's a real contestation and debate about what slavery is and what history means for the 20th century. So the first chapter shows that the League of Nations would, in the 1920s and 30s, be preoccupied with the question of slavery in Liberia and Ethiopia, in the two free and independent African countries. And throughout this period would engage in a variety of efforts at international intervention, mandation, as ways of quelling what they thought to be a humanitarian crisis. What I argue is that we ought to read Black Atlantic writing about slavery and its afterlives and its histories written in the same period of the 1930s as alternative ways of thinking about the legacy of slavery. So the 1930s gives us Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, and then in the 40s we get Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. And these are all, I want to argue, ways of staging both the centrality of slavery to the making of the modern world, their efforts to assert Black self-emancipation against and in contrast to European humanitarian abolitionism. And so there's this contestation around the history of slavery and its legacies for the 20th century become a really important ground for a very important part of the anti-colonial critique leading into the 1950s and 1960s, which is to make the argument that empire itself is a form of enslavement. And so I want to make clear here that what they're saying here is not just to say that it's not only a metaphorical invocation of slavery, right? It's an argument of both the kind of historical continuity I was talking about and a real argument that colonialism and in the new imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th century has actually reproduced the slave status of the African.
Stepping back in time for a moment, you write that, quote, "The first anti-systemic world-making project emerged with the founding of the International Workingsmen Association in 1864. And you also note that, quote, both the Communist Manifesto and Marxist Capital situated the rise of capitalist production and its creation of a world market in imperial expansion. My question is, how was it that this identification of the relationship between capitalism and imperialism first emerged among socialists in the metropole? And then how was it then taken up and adapted by anti-colonialists from across the Black Atlantic?
Yeah, so I think for me, I take seriously the central place of the Haitian Revolution as a site and space in which, for the first time, both an anti-slavery and an anti-colonial politics were constituted. But what I wanted to do by highlighting a kind of Marxist origins through this project of world making was also make clear the kind of intellectual genealogies of the figures that I'm writing about. So for all of them in very circuitous ways, it is an encounter with Marxist thinking that inspires or helps to shape their various critiques of imperialism. So Du Bois's encounters with Marxism in the 1930s very much influence and shape Black Reconstruction, even though he's never, probably not a traditional Marxist. And Andrew Douglas's new book does a great job of thinking about the ways he draws on Marxism, but given his kind of commitments to thinking about race, always has a kind of diagonal relationship to Marx. And similarly, say figures like Nkrumah, it would be an encounter with Lenin and Lenin's writings on imperialism that become really important for him, in addition to his encounters with Garveyism, which he always claimed was the most important figure on his thinking. So,
in fact, he joined, just as a quick aside, he joined a chapter of Garvey's organization when he was at Penn in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Remarkable.
Exactly.
But go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. So I think for me, partly why I center the kind of Marxist moment of thinking the globe as one is it has to do with the ways in which that tradition, in its diversity and its complexity and contradictions, really shape and provides avenues and resources for the set of characters that are central to the book as we go further. I mean, as to why it is that Marx and socialists in the metropole are able to see it, or I think it's really about the period of the late 19th century. And I would say there they're not the only people who begin to see it, but it's really in the 19th century that we get some vision of the world, of world politics as such. Hannah Arendt, writing about the role of imperialism in Origins of Totalitarianism, says this is the moment in which you get something like a world imaginary. And you have a variety of figures, some subaltern figures as well, who are beginning to think the world in this period, and it's because European imperial expansion has reached its height.
World War I was a major turning point for the world system, obviously. And Du Bois saw it as principally caused by imperialism, writing, quote, "The ownership of materials and men in the darker world is the real prize that is setting the nations of Europe at each other's throats today." But strangely enough, South African leader and League of Nations architect Jan Smuts also believed that it was a crisis of imperialism. But he believed that it reflected poorly on some forms of imperialism or colonialism, while actually proving the virtue and necessity of Britain's decentralized model, which he took as a model for the League of Nations, if I remember correctly. Conventionally, the origin of the right to self-determination as decolonization, this beginning of the universalization of Westphalian sovereignty, is associated with the League and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech. But you write that when you look at what was being put in place, it becomes very clear that this moment was not so much an antecedent to decolonization, but rather an attempt at the beginning of a transition to a new form of unequally integrated world order. Well, what did Wilson and Smuts actually envision, and how does it differ with how the League has been remembered?
Yeah, I think, we think of the League of Nations as a kind of the originary moment of a liberal international order, right? That gets corrected and transformed, but largely it gives us the imprints of what we've come to know as liberal internationalism, with Woodrow Wilson as the sort of foundational figure. So in that, when we say that the League is the founding moment of the liberal international order, there's always this question with, well, what do you do with the deep persistences of imperialism and the ways in which that the League is actually now directly involved in imperial, at least oversight, through the mandate system. The mandate system was the mechanism by which former colonies of Germany and territories in the Middle East would be governed. And so oftentimes we get a story in which, well, there were these universal ideals, but they just weren't fully realized in the League of Nations, and they would be gradually realized by the time we get to the United Nations. So what I want to show is that it wasn't actually a problem of the non-realization of the universal principles like self-determination, but the ways in which they were already from the beginning articulated in such a way that empire could become compatible with self-determination. Now, here too, the story of slavery is really important, because what I show is that both Woodrow Wilson and Jan Smuts, already in their pre-World War I writings about their domestic contexts, South Africa for Smuts, and of course the United States for Wilson, were beginning to wrestle with the legacies of emancipation. So for both of them, the idea of kind of, in Wilson's case, radical Republicans, and in Smuts's case, what he calls the revolutionary ideals coming out of 1789, they both argue that these offered a kind of unsustainable and kind of dangerous vision of universal inclusion, right? And so for both of them, these projects had failed, and they had failed in Wilson's imagination to the detriment of African Americans themselves. So for him, and he begins to, these reflections on the Civil War and a Reconstruction emerge alongside Wilson's reflections and thinking on American imperial expansion in the Philippines and elsewhere. And so what he argues in this context is that we have to forego the idea of a universal right or principle of self-government. In fact, self-government means different things for different people, right? And
because the self in self-government is contextually dependent.
Exactly, right. The self and self-government for him is one that we have to think about the capacities of the people, their internal composition. So in the Philippines case, it's the diversity of the peoples in the Philippines islands that excludes them from self-determination. And what I argue is that Wilson is he has a kind of ambivalence, right? On the one hand, he seems to gesture to a kind of older model of civilizational development, one in which eventually all the selves might be ready to have something like self-rule. At other times, though, it seems like, say, something like the internal diversity of the Philippines isn't a surmountable problem of development. So it seems like what he's really after is a much more stable hierarchy in which certain people would never be self-ruling. Smuts, I think, fully resolves this tension, right? So for him, he would say, already in the kind of, even if they don't achieve self-rule of the European variety, they may still be able to, they've still achieved self-rule, right? And, the proto-apartheid state of South Africa already embedded Black self-rule for him in the native administration structures.
There are forms of consent that he believes in that aren't what we would maybe today identify as meaningful democratic control over society.
Right. So in designing the mandate system, for instance, he says, now, of course, the mandate people, should be consulted, but as to whether they want their German masters back, but we all know that they won't actually want their German masters back. So we can assume that mandation is the right choice, right? What's really interesting about Smuts also is, he has a close relationship with liberals in Britain, including J.A. Hobson, an important critic of empire and one who would influence Lenin's account of imperialism. But so Smuts does pick up this argument that imperialism is really the source of war, but his definition of imperialism is one that excludes the British Empire, right? So he makes this disassociation of imperialism and empire. And for him, imperialist states are the Ottoman Empire, Germany, which he calls centralizing states, right? What he thinks is exemplary about the British Empire and why he takes it to be a model for the League is that he says it's an empire that allows for diversity and differentiation. So within the empire, you have Britain itself, you have the dominions like Australia and South Africa. You also have the dependencies, right? And so all of these have variegated forms of rights and duties. And this is for him the kind of model of the international order and what would get instantiated in the League of Nations.
How is this history all rewritten to, exclude Smuts maybe from more popular memory, who played a huge role and was the Prime Minister of South Africa, of all places, and to make Wilson, who was an unabashed white supremacist, to make him the father of decolonization?
I mean, yes, I think that's a good question.
It's weird.
Yeah, it's very weird. But I think one is, I think there is a more general way of thinking about subaltern or Black politics and Black political thought in which it's always derivative, right? Its origins are always in the West, and it becomes a way of telling that story as one of diffusion. So I think that has something to do with it. Two, I really think, in some ways, it's a projection back onto this period about a story of American hegemony throughout the 20th century, right? So it's in part because of the central place of the United States throughout the 20th century, and increasingly as the century wears on, that we can go back to narrate this moment as if Wilson was the only or the primary actor in that particular moment. So it's more a reflection of U.S. power, I think, than of the realities in the period. I think also what happens in that context of writing Wilson as the kind of focal actor is it displaces the centrality and significance of the Bolshevik Revolution and how it was received by Wilson and others as a real threat and challenge to the kind of world order that they were building. And I think this is why it's so important to remember the place of the Communist International's founding in the same year, and the way that that conference articulated a set of critiques of both the League and of the structure of imperialism it continued to enable.
As you mentioned earlier, both Liberia and Ethiopia were members of the League of Nations, and that white-led government's pretext for subjecting them to a second-class status was complaints about slavery in those two countries, a precursor of sorts to what has today become imperialism justified as humanitarianism. And you write that the slavery charges, quote, deflected from the broader question of labor exploitation in colonized territories, while slavery itself was disconnected from colonial labor and cast as an atavistic holdover in backward societies. Du Bois said of Liberia, quote, her chief crime is to be black and poor in a rich white world, and in precisely that portion of the world where color is ruthlessly exploited as a foundation for American and European wealth, part of the whole colonial slave labor system. I had no idea about this history of the Liberia and Ethiopia's time in the League. How did a colonial system rooted in the slave trade come to project slavery onto Africa as a problem almost endemic to the continent that white people would save the continent from? And what was the actually existing colonial labor system that this all obscured?
One of the things that's important to remember is that anti-slavery imperialism is already written into the scramble for Africa. So if you look at the treaty that comes out of the Berlin Conference, there are anti-slavery clauses in there in which all the European states commit to fighting slavery in the territories that they control. And this is a central
It's the most deeply perverse thing.
It is deeply perverse, yes. By the time we get to the crisis of slavery within Liberia and Ethiopia in the interwar period, a variety of things are reinforcing this kind of argument. So one, as I say, it is a strategy of deflection. It's a way of both, celebrating or the idea of European success in abolishing slavery. So the argument is that everywhere that Europe actually controls African territory, slavery has in fact been abolished, right? And in it's these two territories in which there is no European rule that slavery persists. It operates with a really minimalist account of what slavery is. So in which ownership and sale are the primary vectors through which we understand what slavery is. So what this obscures about the broader landscape of colonial labor, and it varies in a variety of ways, are all the ways in which the colonial state is actively involved in coercing Black labor, right? Very directly sometimes. So the Slavery Convention of 1926 actually has exemptions for forced labor when it is used for public works. So in those cases, colonial state could actually could have regimes of forced labor to build roads and so forth. So there's those kinds of exemptions, but also the very apparatus of, or the colonial regimes, labor regimes enacted during this period are ones that use a variety of measures, taxation, land alienation, to compel laborers to work on plantations and mines, to work in towards the export economy rather than in subsistence economies. So it's this broad, and in a variety of ways. So this, as I've said, the Slavery Convention has that exemption. And then by the time you do get a forced labor convention in the 30s, it basically frames these structures of labor compulsion as if they were traditional forms of labor compulsion. And so it basically reinforces the idea that forms of coercion are central to the ways in which African labor is managed. So I think it is important to note that that there are deeply, in both of these countries, it's not that my argument is not that forms of slavery and labor coercion did not exist. They did exist, right? But I think it's important to understand that they were largely embedded in a broader colonial apparatus, right? So, for instance, in this Liberia case, there's one of the important charges against Liberia is that migrant laborers are going from Liberia to other territories controlled by Spain in this case. When this comes out in the League's report, League officials say, well, this is all Liberia's fault because they're the ones benefiting from the sale. But no one questions what are the kind of broader structures that require migrant labor in other colonial territories. So,
like Firestone employing them.
Like Firestone employing. So that's the other actor that gets completely that has no responsibility for this is Firestone Rubber Company, which is the largest private company in Liberia, and the report says again that Firestone authorities never knowingly employed slave labor, right? It's only when the government was in charge of recruitment that they ended up with some slave labor, right? So almost every other actor that's embedded in the structure of extracting labor is excused, sidelined, and obscured so that the real problem becomes Black states and African states, right? Those are the engines of humanitarian crisis.
And then perhaps what's most revealing of all and most chilling in terms of thinking back on things like the justification of the invasion of Iraq, is that it was these charges of slavery that were used by fascist Italy as a pretext for its 1935 invasion of Ethiopia.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to actually go back here to a thing you said earlier, which is, Wilson is a rabid white supremacist, and certainly so is, and I don't think that's not true, but I think it's important that for me, the point of that chapter isn't to say these two white supremacists created a world that just reinforced their ideology. But really what I wanted to show in the League's engagements and interactions with Ethiopia and Liberia is that how racialization is actually produced in the very interaction with international law, right? It's the constant iterative ideas that in every moment of reform, there's always this anxiety that actually they're not going to come through, right? The reforms are going to fail. And it's these kind of sedimented layers in which Ethiopia and Liberia have all these obligations and very little rights in the system. It's this constant suggestion that actually, ultimately, they're not going to be able to realize the reforms that creates a kind of a racialization of Ethiopia and Liberia, in which basically, at the end of it, I argue that Black sovereignty itself becomes an impossible vision. So by 1935, Italy writes a 60-page memorandum to the League justifying its upcoming invasion of Ethiopia, basically on the very terms that the League had been laying out for the last, almost 2 decades, right? So what this allows them to do is two things, I think. One, it casts Ethiopia outside of the protections of international law so that, forms of warfare that would otherwise be illegitimate are no longer, in their perspective, illegitimate in the case of Ethiopia. And it casts Italy itself as the kind of protector or guarantor of international law. It's the one that's fulfilling the League's mission of abolishing slavery.
The invasion of Ethiopia, you write, quote, marked a critical turning point in the politics of Black anti-colonialism, after which pan-Africanism was revived as, quote, an autonomous project of world revolution in which colonized subjects, rather than the metropolitan proletariat, were the key agents of global transformation. And you write about a lot of different things happening during this period. Du Bois had initially supported the League, but turned against it as he embraced Marxism. CLR James made a similar turn after embracing Trotskyism. James shifted tack after the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations and failed to forcefully fight Italian imperialism. Meanwhile, George Padmore, someone we haven't talked about yet, but who played a really important role and is a major figure in your book, he had always been a communist, but then turned away from the International too, for the same reasons. What role did the League of Nations and the invasion of Ethiopia together have in forming what is known as the Black International? And what was the Black International?
The Italian invasion of Ethiopia has a real incredible becomes a galvanizing force within the Black Atlantic. So there are protests and petitions and various forms of action, strikes all over the Black world, in the Caribbean, in the United States. African Americans try to volunteer to fight for Haile Selassie's army. So it's a really powerful and important moment, in part because Ethiopia had been up until that moment the symbol of Black independence, or a symbol of Black independence, right? Ethiopia, both as a site and a kind of imaginary of Black freedom, had played a central role for Black people throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. So it's a real moment of crisis, and also a real moment of politicization for various kinds of actors. So in this moment, I think there is a variety of ways that the three figures, Du Bois, James, Padmore, all in some ways from very divergent places begin to converge around a set of questions, a set of ideas. So Du Bois, when the League is formed, for instance, and he's not unique in this, I think, he thinks that a real internationalization of the mandate system, for instance, might be a good way of, one, introducing forms of local self-rule, and two, like engaging in a project of development in which development is actually for the mandated territories rather than against them. And so I think he remains committed to this project of internationalization.
And he sort of sees like educated American Black people from a somewhat imperial perspective at this point.
Yes, I mean, that's true. And this is a kind of reoccurring feature of his thought, but also other figures in the period, including Marcus Garvey, someone he saw as a kind of really bitterly opposed to. So I think it's both an encounter with Marxism, viewing the ways in which that project of internationalization in the mandate system had failed, that places Du Bois by the 30s into a much more critical orientation to the League. But he is, a very complex figure, and we don't, even into the 40s and 50s, say around trusteeship, the trusteeship model, he, along with other figures like Raymond Logan and Ralph Bunche, remain committed to the idea that some form of internationalization may be a good way of thinking about development and political and social transformation of the colonies. We can get back to this later, but I think part of what's driving that impetus for them and for Du Bois is this worry that national independence itself would not be sufficient. And of course, this is a theme throughout the book, right? So that maybe internationalization through these institutions offers some set of resources. So James similarly, writes an essay as late as 1933, celebrating British anti-slavery in the 19th century and making an argument for Britain playing a central role in fighting the last vestiges of slavery around the world. And it is in the context of the crisis in Ethiopia, and again the failure of Britain, France, and others to stand with Ethiopia. He really begins to reject this argument, right? And writes in this moment an important book, World Revolution, which traces the rise and fall of the Communist International, where he also makes the argument for tries to explain why it is that the Communist International could not play the role of supporting a more robust anti-colonial internationalism. And for him, really, the failure isn't just the Soviet joining the League and supporting Italy or not boycotting Italy, but a earlier moment in which the revolution in Germany had failed, and the announcement of socialism in one country. So already for him by the 1920s, we see the kind of where the League would end, or where the Communist International would end up by the 30s. And then finally, we have George Padmore, who, as you note, is a member of the Communist International. I mean, probably the most prominent Black leader within the Communist International. And, him and other Black communists in this period are very much criticized by the Soviet Union leaders for their support of what they see as bourgeois nationalism in their kind of critique of international politics in Liberia and Ethiopia and Haiti. And they themselves become frustrated, Padmore and others become frustrated with the inability of the international to support a much more robust vision of anti-colonialism. So these three figures, in some ways, for me, I use them in a way to index this pivot and to something like a Black international. Now, the language of Black internationalism already existed in the 20s and 30s. Brent Hayes Edwards' book, The Practice of Diaspora, does a great job kind of walking us through the various iterations of what Black internationalism meant in the 20s and 30s. But what I want these three figures and their transformations in this period to indicate is the kind of reemergence of a pan-Africanism that's very much trained on the question of independence and concerned with the political and institutional processes, mechanisms by which independence could be realized on both nationally and internationally. The other thing is increasingly for especially someone like Padmore, who wants to see it as a kind of independent site of building both politics and building a kind of conception of what a post-colonial or post-imperial world would be like. So one that's outside of the shadow of the Communist International and a real its own sort of political force in the world. The culmination of this would be the 1945 Manchester Conference, Pan-African Conference, which would be the fifth one and which would be organized largely by George Padmore and Kwame Nkrumah.
And so Padmore, who had the longest track record as a communist, is it fair to say that he becomes the most disaffected and most nationalist of these figures?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think there is a lot of treatments of Padmore that make this sharp bifurcation, the communist Padmore and then the nationalist or Pan-Africanist Padmore. But, what he argues for, especially in his book, Pan-Africanism or Communism, and throughout his kind of engagements in the 1950s, he becomes a really important part of Nkrumah's first administration, when Nkrumah is elected prime minister of Ghana. He makes the case that Pan-Africanism should incorporate communism and the traditions of Marxist thinking, but securing independence becomes a much more central way that he's thinking about what the goals and aspirations of Pan-Africanists ought to be. I mean, it is true that in this period, he does begin to modulate. So as I show, I mean, in the 30s, he had called Marcus Garvey like a similar, the language of a bourgeois nationalist, one who obscured class relations, right? By the time we get his writings on Pan-Africanism, he begins to claim Garvey as a kind of foundational figure in this project of Pan-Africanism.
Let's turn to the unfolding of formal decolonization, which begins in 1957 with Kwame Nkrumah announcing Ghana's independence and ending its time as the British colony of the Gold Coast. And he said, quote, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent." What Nkrumah wanted wasn't just independence defined in the liberal terms of non-interference, but independence in the Republican sense of non-domination. And that would require that African states become not only formally independent, but in essence that they join together to form a single federal state. In the Caribbean, Eric Williams, who became the first prime minister of Trinidad and Tobago after having published the classic work, Capitalism and Slavery, he pushed for federated government there in the Caribbean, and 10 West Indian states initially were members of a West Indian Federation. In Africa, Ghana, Guinea, Mali all included provisions in their constitutions to surrender their sovereignty to a union of African states when and if it was created. It's a fascinating moment that you're writing about and that I was not really aware of. What did leaders like Nkrumah and Williams see as the post-colonial trap of false sovereignty? And why did they believe that federation was the political and economic solution? In other words, what was the empire that remained after formal independence? And how did they plan to overcome it?
So for both of them, the real anxiety is that, okay, formal independence gives us something like sovereign equality in the international order, but it leaves us still in relations of economic dependence, right? So small states like Ghana and Trinidad are appendages to the global economy that largely produce primary agricultural products, right? And so they're constantly dependent on the international market to sell these goods. So they're entirely externally oriented economies, right? And the anxiety here for them, and Kwame Nkrumah's thesis of neocolonialism really captures this, is that these forms of economic dependence mean that you're constantly open to the possible encroachment of foreign actors, right? And these actors might be states like former imperial powers or the new superpowers, or they may be corporate forms, right? So for Nkrumah says, having won formal independence, we might think that our elected representatives now serve the interests of the citizens of the post-colonial state. But in fact, because
we've got a flag, we've got a national anthem.
Right. We have a parliament that meets in the national capital, right? But in fact, because of the externally oriented character of these economies, because of these structures of economic dependence, these newly elected leaders, these representatives of the nation, are much more likely to be co-opted, are much more likely to be, in fact, unwillingly serving or perhaps willingly also serving the interests of external actors, right? So,
and perhaps even more so that they're not just that they might be co-opted, but they're not actually governing.
Right. Yeah. I think he says the more extreme versions of this would be, outright military intervention, right? And so he thinks the Congo is one instance of this, the Vietnam is another instance. So for him, neocolonialism itself is a kind of variegated category, right? Which has different kinds of iterations, right? And I think in some ways, what the Republican language of non-domination or arbitrary power allows us to see is it doesn't really matter actually for him whether in fact these forms of encroachment are happening or not. It's the possibility that they might happen, that the vulnerability to these forms of encroachment and intervention that themselves ought to be the sources of anxiety, right? So then it's what does federation make possible for them? How might federation make possible a kind of exit from these forms of economic dependence? And the central argument for both Kwame Nkrumah and Eric Williams here is that by reorienting ourselves towards other similarly situated post-colonial states, by creating both political and economic unification among those states, we could create an economy that was more internally self-sufficient, right? We would create an economy that was directed inward to this new federated space. And by doing this, we would gradually kind of erode those relations of economic dependence. And simultaneously, we would have better political standing on the international politics, both because our larger size, right? But also because of greater economic independence. So the whole structure then of the federation, I think is like, it's both a spatial and institutional way of thinking about how one might restructure relations of international economic dependence.
Somewhat surprisingly, both Nkrumah and Williams, if I remember correctly, they both pointed to the United States as an exemplar because it had used confederation to become the most powerful nation on earth. But the U.S., of course, was and is a settler colonialist nation and an imperialist one. What does their appeal to the U.S. example reveal? Did these Black leaders, now governing unitary nation states imposed upon rather plural societies, all while seeking to create even larger federated polities, did they miss other lessons from 1787 in terms of how federation under the U.S. Constitution served to facilitate internal colonization and imperialism?
Yeah, this was probably one of the most surprising things I also learned upon visiting the archives and reading the papers of these two thinkers, is the ways that the example of the United States was constantly invoked in making the case for West Indian Federation and the United States of Africa. So, I think this is a deeply puzzling example. And I think there's a variety of things going on here, right? One, I think it served a powerful rhetorical example for them, right? In two ways, right? One, Nkrumah was especially prone to do this, is to say, if you think about decolonization as a project of, that's now has spanned almost 200 years. If we think of the United States as having undergone a form of decolonization in 1776, and you look out in the world and you think this is the only post-colonial success story in some case, right? All these other contexts, Latin America, Eastern Europe, suffer the very forms of economic dependence that we are also facing in the contemporary moment. And these are all spaces, he argues, where various attempts at unification had been unsuccessful, right? It's a kind of here the impetus is to try and persuade fellow nationalists that this is in fact the way to the focus, what the focus ought to be, right? In a broader international framework, there's also a way of trying, I think, to use the United States' own its own story of itself as a post-colonial nation, as the first post-colonial nation, to push back against U.S. imperial power at this time. And this is really important, say, in the case of Trinidad and Eric Williams, where the United States very actively has bases on in Trinidad, and he's involved in the same period that he's invoking the U.S. as an example in a bitter fight with U.S. imperial power and military presence in the Caribbean. Yeah, so I think these are the kinds of ways in which they're trying to strategically deploy this example. I think that there's another powerful thing that the example does, right, which is to transform narratives about post-colonial failure in the third world that are tied to cultural deficits into stories of institutional absence, right? So the argument here is that the United States is not exemplary because the Anglo-Saxon people or the American people have a specific capacity or endowment for freedom, right? But because they built the appropriate institutional forms, right? And so this means that there's nothing to stop the West Indies or Africa from similarly securing post-colonial freedom, right? But I think your question, is really right on in some sense, because it illuminates some real blind spots of these two thinkers. And namely, this has to do with how their kind of fixation on centralizing and aggregating political authority, right? They see this as the primary mechanism and means by which to overcome this problem of economic dependence, while sidelining and marginalizing very real questions of internal pluralism, right?
Which are already almost immediately problems within independent African nation states, let alone a continental federation.
Exactly. I mean, so, one of the really striking things in the Ghanaian example is that in the lead up to Ghanaian independence, Kwame Nkrumah rejected arguments for internal federation, which were largely mobilized by the Ashanti Kingdom, which had various kinds of autonomy within the British imperial structure, right? And I think there's really important debates and tensions around why that was. And for him, the forms of autonomy that the Ashanti Kingdom did have were kind of non-democratic, et cetera. But I think there was a real failure on his part and others to imagine what would be mechanisms to, institutionalize, to preserve various forms of internal autonomy. And I think, this blind spot does come back to haunt him because it's precisely these kinds of anxieties and these kinds of questions that give other anti-colonial nationalists and post-colonial states greatest pause when he begins to make the arguments for federation on the continental stage.
How did Nkrumah see the secession crises in Congo and in Nigeria?
I mean, so he's by the time Biafra is happening, he himself is out of power. There's a coup in Ghana in 1966. But, the question of Katangan secession for him becomes a real story about the international politics of decolonization, right? So he's immediately drawn to the ways and the role of international actors in the secession. So both that Belgian officers helped and sort of, I wouldn't say instigated, but at least supported the Katangan secession, right? And then it immediately becomes a proxy war of the Cold War. But again, I think what this obscures is the real internal domestic questions about how to organize post-colonial government, right? Whether and in what forms local autonomy and self-rule might be institutionalized in these large and complex post-colonial societies. But at the same time, I think he was really prescient, for instance, around how the Congo crisis becomes this way again of reintroducing or reinforcing the language of racial incapacity for self-rule, right? So the example becomes almost immediately a story about African unpreparedness for independence, right? One narrative about Congo that gets repeated throughout this period is how few people have college degrees, right? How few people have been educated in the Congo. And this becomes somehow an implicit way of suggesting that perhaps independence had come too soon to the Congo.
Not for explicitly biologically racial reasons, but based on supposedly facially neutral criteria like educational attainment.
Yes, exactly.
The West Indian Federation only lasted from 1958 to 1962 after voters in a 1961 referendum in Jamaica rejected it. Soon thereafter, most African states also rejected federation in favor of a looser alliance under the Organization for African Unity. What were the key criticisms raised by people like Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria and Norman Manley in Jamaica, and why ultimately, we've talked about a lot of problems and obstacles in the Federation project, but why did it ultimately fall apart?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, the criticisms of Norman Manley and Nnamdi Azikiwe are parallel, although they take a slightly different form. So overall, the thrust of the criticism is, on the one hand, it starts from a kind of agreement on the first point around the interrelationship between union and independence, right? So both Azikiwe and Norman Manley accept the idea that in order for post-colonial states to secure some form of independence in the international order, they will have to engage in unification, regional unification. But what they're both anxious about is the structure of the unifications that Nkrumah and Williams are advocating. And as I show, in some ways, in both their hands, federation, which is a structure of equal member states, is increasingly looks internally like a state-like project, right? So both of them want highly centralized federal governments, which have powers of taxation, powers to plan a regional economy, and a lot of the powers they're interested in providing within the federal government are economic.
Which has a logic to it in terms of like if you're going to remake the economic relationships of dependence with the global North, then you need to have a diversified economy internally, but also use taxation and redistribution to ensure that you don't have major internal inequalities. But that's still a lot of power in one place.
It's a lot of power, yeah. And yeah, so for in the context of Jamaica and or the context of the West Indies, on the one hand, for the smaller islands, who are part of the federation, in fact, like these are very appealing. So a lot of smaller island states do not want to have a customs union without robust forms of redistribution because they don't want to be captured markets of larger states like Trinidad and Jamaica. But for Jamaica, which is itself, is the largest of the 10 states that would have been part of the West Indies. It had up until this period its own development plan, right? That required had protectionist clauses, especially vis-a-vis Trinidad. And so there's a real anxiety here that the economic burdens of the federation would unduly be placed on Jamaica. And so that's one reason. And two, there's a kind of complicated politics around representation and whether or not representation in the lower house should be solely on the basis of population or whether there needs to be some other calculation. And so in this context, it's important to remember that Norman Manley is facing a very insistent opposition.
Because he's actually kind of a pro-federation person within the Jamaican context.
He is a pro-federation person within the Jamaican context, and he's a left social democrat, socialist. I don't know how you describe him. Yeah, I mean, he's not. I mean, we'll talk about his son in a little while. So he's not a social democrat of the kind that his son would be in the 70s. But certainly, he represents the left of the nationalist split in this period. So it's under intense domestic pressure and opposition that he asks for a series of concessions from within the Federalist negotiations, and he's the one who suggests the referendum, but he only suggests it because he thinks he'll be able to win, actually. But of course, he loses the federal vote. I mean, I think there's the kind of historical processes by which the Federation, which led ultimately to the demise of the Federation. But this question about what the appropriate balance of union and independence would be remains salient in the African experience as well. So in that context, we're dealing there with already independent states. The worry there is actually there's a lot of openness to the possibility of economic integration. So here, surprisingly, the worry is less economic than political. And the anxiety is that this creates a new form of regional hegemony, right? So what Ezekwe is arguing for, actually, he calls it a miniature United Nations, right? One that has contains within it protections like non-intervention and equal sovereignty, while creating room for forms of functional integration around regional security, around economic integration. So I think, one of the things that's really important about this federal debate for me is about the challenge that around how do you build kind of regional federations that both, make possible meaningful forms of self-rule at various levels of the federation, right? While also having robust mechanisms for redistribution and economic transformation. And it seems to me that what this federal experiment in the Black Atlantic stages in some ways is the like difficulties and tensions around those two questions.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Phenomenal World, a publication run out of the Jane Family Institute that puts out rigorous and clarifying research and writing to help you understand the complexities of the global political economy. Phenomenal World has featured many excellent Dig guests like Tim Barker, Melinda Cooper, Femi Taiwo, Daniela Gabor, and Isabella Weber. If you're looking for deep analysis of things like the politics of monetary policy, the relationship between financial capital and development in the global south, how organized labor lost the construction industry, how the IMF is making it hard for poor countries to decarbonize, the way US dollar hegemony shapes global politics, and so much more, visit phenomenalworld.org and subscribe to get their original articles and their weekly newsletters of relevant research and writing. That's phenomenalworld.org. Head there to read and subscribe. I'm ad-libbing this into the ad, but so you know, it is a really good publication, and I will put a link in the show notes. Your book isn't about Francophone anti-colonialist thinking, but that is in some ways the counterpoint, I think, to Williams and Nkrumah's model. Léopold Senghor of Senegal and Aimé Césaire of Martinique proposed decolonization not as independence, but rather as the democratization of the empire, both politically and as a means to ensure that decolonized people within a democratized imperial polity would receive a fair share of the wealth that had been created on the colony's backs. How did this model of decolonization differ, both in terms of it differing pretty obviously in its solution to colonialism that it proposed, but also in terms of how it diagnosed the problem?
I mean, I would say in a lot of ways, not totally all similar, but the diagnosis of the problem for me is very similar. I mean, Senghor similarly talks about the problem of economic dependence, the kind of instability and fragility of being a small state in a global economy. And so there's a way in which at least that kind of diagnosis is shared. But I think the institutional conditions of possibility for these set of actors is really different. I mean, Senghor and Aimé Césaire are both operate in contexts where there are already institutionally sites of citizenship and incorporation for Francophone subjects. So, for instance, in Senegal, there were these 4 communes from which representatives were elected and could serve in the French Assembly, right? Similarly, Martinique had that even before this period, right? So there's already internal to the French Empire, I think, a real debate about the possibilities of imperial citizenship. So I think this is one place where the diagnosis changes, right? So they're operating partly in a context in which the contours and conditions of imperial citizenship are really at the center of the questions that they're asking about what transition to a post-imperial world order would look like. But I do think they face real challenges around race. And for instance, at no point, and this is drawing on Fred Cooper's work, at no point is equal representation really on the table for these colonies. So if there were equal representation, the colonies would have a majority of the seats in whatever imperial parliament or assembly might have been constituted, right? And so all the proposals never have this kind of possibility of equal representation. But I think for Césaire and Senghor, I mean, part of their claim is that we also as colonial subjects have contributed to the creation of the French nation, right? And so it's a similar kind, again, similar to the languages that anti-colonial nationalists in the Anglophone world would use, but there's a claim to equality within the Francophone world, within the French Empire. And that's where the debate really happens. I mean, so what makes the Anglophone context really different is that, one, there is already a kind of long history of anti-colonial nationalism within the British Empire, right? So if you think about Irish nationalism in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, the example of India, and in the British context, when imperial federation had been discussed, it had always been at the exclusion of its colored subjects, right? So what I think is so interesting about the Anglophone world in some ways is the fact that these set of thinkers are trying to imagine federation in a context in which, whether or not they like it or liked it, they had to accept national independence, right? Or those were the terms in which they had to struggle with the empire. So I think that's the real difference between the two cases.
Huh. Yeah. So it wasn't really that they so much dismissed the Senghor's model as an ideal, but just it was prima facie impossible for them.
Yes. And I think, there are earlier moments in the British imperial context where that was not the case. So if you look at early Indian National Congress writings of the late 19th century or West African nationalists, even into the early 20th century, there are demands for equal citizenship, the rights of the British Empire, and so forth. And this is certainly true in the British West Indies, which has been in the empire for a much longer period. So equal rights within the empire were a central language of anti-colonial critique, but that moment was foreclosed much earlier in the British context than in the French one.
I want to turn to the major project that anti-colonial nationalists took up after the failure of federation, which was something they fought for in the United Nations called the New International Economic Order, or NIEO. It was similar in a lot of ways to the logic of the argument for post-colonial federation. The NIEO's architects identified neocolonialism as rooted in the global South's dependence on selling primary goods to the former metropole. What was the NIEO? How did it come about? And how did it propose to create what you call a welfare world, a form of global class politics that went beyond a mere demand for aid or even reparations, and that instead figured the global South's sale of primary goods as analogous to the working class's sale of its labor power?
Yeah, great. So here, the story of kind of economic dependence changes a little bit. So as I said, the neocolonialism thesis really focused on the possibility that external actors might manipulate or deploy the structures of economic dependence. Here, the anxiety is that the very structural apparatus of the international economy persistently undermines the capacity for post-colonial government. And very front and center in the minds of Julius Nyerere and Michael Manley, who are my figures in this part of the book, is the experience of declining terms of trade, right? The fact that the primary goods that they are selling on the global market are, in fact, the prices are falling dramatically for these products. So that any capacity to sort of deploy the revenues from this, from the sale of these primary goods to transform the domestic economies is persistently undermined by the very.
This is a crisis in the import and substitution industrialization.
Yes, it's a
model.
crisis in the import substitution model, but more generally, the focus on, say, the problem of dependence shifts less. It becomes less about, again, external actors that might deploy it, but that the very structure of the global economy generates arbitrary forms of power, right? It constrains the capacities of action in a variety of ways, and these are constantly outside of the control of the post-colonial states. So this is where they begin from. And, and this in some ways leads to a kind of retelling or that long history of unequal integration I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. Now, both Michael Manley, especially Manley and the Caribbean context, would really emphasize that a state like Jamaica is entirely a product of its international relations, right? It comes out of an imperial process. It's constituted by that international context. And so it's a creature of the global economic order in some ways. And so what this also does is it forecloses for them another possible option, which is exit, right? Delinking or autarkic forms of efforts to try and secure self-rule or end independence.
Which Tanzania moves a little closer to.
Although, even in that context where Nyerere talks about self-reliance, I mean, he always argues that self-reliance has to be situated and articulated within a context of international interdependence.
It's a primitive communism that he's advocating, but not a archaic one.
Yeah, so he does think that the village community can be a different site of organizing political and economic life within the post-colony. And this is really more of a rejection of arguments like Nkrumah's, which really had prioritized industrialization, right? So the emphasis for Nyerere becomes less industrialization and an attempt to try and create more egalitarian forms of production, both and social organization. So it's a break with kind of model of post-colonial development that really emphasizes industrialization. But for both of them, really, this idea that one might sort of remove oneself, extricate oneself fully from the international economy is not one that they entertained, right? So they begin from this deep belief in the embedded character of the post-colonial world or in their post-colonial states within the global economy. And the question then becomes, how might you generate out of this embeddedness? How might you generate a kind of egalitarian global economy? And so this is where we get the kind of analogy to the working classes, right? That the sale of primary goods and the sale of one's labor is actually analogous. Nyerere makes the direct analogy with workers, and then Manley often says that the post-colonial world are like the rural sector, the farmers of the world. So I think this is what's really interesting is I think this analogy shifts the language around the global economy from a language of aid to a kind of new politics of assertion, right? So in making this argument that the post-colonial world are the workers of the world, what Nyerere says is that the choice for the North Atlantic world is either violent revolution, as it was before the kind of capital labor bargain that led to the welfare state, or it can be a mediated form of collaboration and negotiation that leads us to something that we can all both agree on, right? So
they want a post-war class settlement for the global South.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really interesting because, we didn't talk about this, but right after World War II and the formation of the United Nations, the thing Ezekwe says is there is no New Deal for the Black man, right? And so we might think of the NIEO as one space, not the only space, but one space in which anti-colonial nationalists try to realize a New Deal for the world, right? A New Deal for the Black world in particular. Now, of course, the challenge around how to think about a capital labor settlement for the world is that there is no state mechanism or coercive state mechanism in the international order that could generate that kind of negotiation and that kind of agreement.
Nor is it clear exactly how, if the global South as a whole is the working class, what their power is to wage class war. What's their strike?
Right. So One of the things they do try to do is build associations around products that they produce, right? And here, really, the model is OPEC. And OPEC plays a central role as both an inspiration for the new international economic order and as a model of the possible forms of, it's not a strike, but a way of generating leverage in the international economy. So there's like bauxite associations and all these commodity associations. And the attempt is to kind of collaborate and set prices collectively. So that's one version of the ways that they try to intervene in this global economy. The second, I think, which is equally important, is to begin to make this argument. They've already made versions of this argument in earlier iterations that we ought to think about the General Assembly of the UN as a kind of as the primary site in which economic policy is for the world will be generated, right? And this is an attempt to think again about various kinds of ways in which the international order might compensate for price loss, may pay for technology transfer, et cetera. But that because the General Assembly offers, equality of all states, that this might be the space to generate new forms of economic regulation.
I talked about this recently with Noura Erakat in about her book about Palestine, but about how the decolonizing world, its eventual majority in the General Assembly, allows anti-colonial nationalists to totally hijack the UN and take it in a very different direction than was envisioned by its founders.
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial, I think. The story of the United Nations for the 30 to 40 years after its founding is really about the gradual capture of the UN forum for the politics of decolonization. And this is what happens in the context of the NIEO as well. And, both the combination of the oil crisis and its consequences and this new kind of assertive politics of the third world really do, for a brief moment, make it feel like that there may be concessions from the North Atlantic world, including the United States, right? So, which, is short-lived, but I think it's important to remember that the NIEO was not just a kind of sort of fantasy of an alternative world order, but one that had to be taken seriously, for a very brief, but I think a really illuminating moment.
In the 1970s, the Global South's commodity trap turned into a debt trap, or became also a debt trap, which cemented this global hierarchy of domination that we've been discussing the whole interview by subjecting poor countries to the terms of international financial institutions' structural adjustment programs. And meanwhile, OPEC, which was in many ways a flexing of Global South economic muscle and that initially inspired these other commodity cartels, their rise and ultimately revealed that solidarity amongst oil-producing Global South states meant food price hikes for the rest. To what extent can the failure of the NIEO and of anti-colonial world-making in general, can it be attributed to a corporate and first world reaction, an assault on radical decolonization? And to what degree was it instead, and these are not mutually exclusive explanations by any means, caused by extraordinarily difficult to overcome, if not insuperable, internal contradictions imposed upon the anti-colonial project by the larger political economy of decolonization that they existed within from the get-go?
I think, the explanation has to be both. So there were real internal contradictions of this project. And, we talked about them a little bit around the federation question, around the insistence on unitary states and plural context, right, as one version of an internal contradiction. In the context of the NIEO, this imagination of the post-colonial states as workers of the world both kind of obscure deep differences within the third world, right, between more powerful states, resource-rich states like those in OPEC and those that would be largely importing oil, right? But also within these countries, if you imagine Tanzania and Jamaica as itself the working class, it obscured internal class politics, right?
There goes the national bourgeoisie of each of those countries.
Right, exactly. And so there's a way in which these were really important internal contradictions of the project or tensions that were not fully resolved, that were obscured. And at the same time, you have this an external assault that both strategically deploys these internal crises. And then it's really important to note that the emerging debt crisis changes the terrain of struggle, right? So post-colonial states find themselves in a very different place in the late 1970s and into the 80s than they did at the beginning of the 70s, right? So they're in a different they're not in the same negotiating and bargaining position that they had been, right? So I think we have to keep in mind the shifting terrain of global politics in which these struggles are being waged, and the ways in which external actors who were opposed or critical of the projects were able to point to these internal contradictions and tensions to both call into question the kind of cohesion and coherence of the project, to make visible what they would call the hypocrisy of the project. So I, end the book with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's very briefly U.S. representative to the UN. And in this very illuminating essay, The United States in Opposition, he writes about the ways in which the United States should come out more forcefully against the NIEO, and it should do so by calling out, third world authoritarianism, by insisting that this politics of equality really obscured domestic relations of inequality and hierarchy, right? And so it's a project that takes, it's a critique that picks up on, I think, important tensions of the project and manages to use them as resources to combat and undermine the project altogether.
Yeah, he says, quote, "A vast majority of the nations of the world feel there are claims which can be made on the wealth of individual nations that are both considerable and threatening. A tyranny of the new majority that failed to understand that their economic condition was of their own making and no one else's. And so no claim on anyone else arises in consequence." That's a mishmash of different parts of that speech that you quote.
Yeah.
I found that powerful because it reveals how the global north and capital succeed in depoliticizing this new iteration of imperial global economics by portraying a system that prioritized particular interests, as it always had, as a neutral and thus universal system. And it reminded me a lot of what played out domestically in the post-civil rights United States in terms of normalizing inequality.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it's really interesting to think about someone like Daniel Patrick Moynihan because he plays such an important role both domestically, right?
Tangle of pathology.
Yeah, as the author of the Moynihan Report. And he writes a lot actually about third world and human rights, the article on the NIEO that I've quoted. So I think it is, an important place to think once more about the interrelationship between the domestic and the international. I also think, one important site of depoliticization is around the international financial institutions, right? So if the new international economic order, part of its argument is for a kind of politicization of questions around the economy, and an argument that the General Assembly ought to be the site and space in which international economic policy is managed, what the claim of the IMF and World Bank is to say that these are spaces and sites of technical expertise, and that we are the best positioned to provide economic policy for the international order. Here, too, I think there's an important analogy with the growing role of, say, central banks within domestic societies, right? Where there's a similar kind of depoliticization of economic questions. I'll say one other thing about this, which is, one real, I think, shortcoming or limit around the new international economic order was also its preoccupation with the question of trade, largely, not entirely, but largely, and only a belated interest in questions of finance and monetary policy. So by 1980, in the midst of the debt crisis, which has already led to structural adjustment in Jamaica, Nyerere hosts a conference.
And just as an aside, just for context, crushed Michael Manley's dreams of a social democratic Jamaica and led him to believe that there is no alternative.
Yes. I mean, in 1 year after the structural adjustment is introduced, the kinds of economic progress and shrinking of inequality that had occurred in 4 years had been completely wiped out in just 1 year. So it's a really devastating moment for Jamaica and for broadly the example of third world socialism. But what I was going to say was, there's a belated conference in Tanzania around international monetary policy. It's a kind of amazing, it's arguments for a kind of foregoing the US dollar as the kind of global currency. It's making, attempts to curtail the power of the International Monetary Fund. But, these attempts at kind of thinking about finance and monetary policy are almost belated. It's almost after the defeat of the project. I mean, they've lived on in different other iterations and have come back and so forth, but they show in some ways one of the other limits of the NIEO.
To what extent was the nation state form itself, like as an institution, a driving force in locking in the system that emerged? Because this global dynamic reminds me, again, a lot of the domestic dynamic in the U.S., where jurisdictional boundaries between municipalities, how they powerfully naturalize and normalize inequality. And the way the Pyrrhic victory of nation-state independence reminds me a lot of the empty promise of Black political power in U.S. cities, where Black politicians took control of local governments just as capital relocated beyond their reach.
Yeah, I think again, that's a really powerful analogy about, the domestic and the international, and one that really illuminates what was at stake, say, for domestic invocations of the internal colony, or for attempts to think through, say, the concept of self-determination. I mean, I do think one of my points, though, is we shouldn't think of the figures who occupied the nation-state form as, naive about the limitations of the nation-state, right? I think what we learned from this set of anti-colonial nationalists is that they were deeply attuned to the kind of, at least some of the limits and traps of the nation state. And they tried over the period of 30 years to try to overcome them and circumvent them, right? So I think what's important about that also is we tend to tell a story about the nation state's limits that really begins in the 1970s, right? We say this is the moment in which we learned really, beginning with the age of neoliberal globalization, where we learned really about the limits of the nation state form. But I think for the post-colonial world, those set of limits were already visible even before they had nation states, right? And so I think there's something really important about recovering how figures were forced to, were embedded in the system of nation states, but were very prescient about its limits and sought to transform it. And I think I say it's important to recover that because I think in our own moment, it seems to me, it's true, we might say that a world system of nation states, it obscures the various forms of international forces acting on us, right? And it acts as a set of traps and naturalizes boundaries. But it seems to me we also have to, we live in these structures, right? And so our approach can't be one that just wishes them away, but tries to work in, through, and beyond them to transform the set of relations.
You write, quote, "With the more ambitious world-making projects waning on the international stage, nationalists deployed the more minimalist version of internationalism, in which the international order merely secured the rights of the nation-state to shield repressive practices from international scrutiny. This, quote, not only prioritized the precious nature of external sovereignty over its internal instability, but also equated internal dissent with external intervention, foreclosing the possibility of contesting the terms of postcolonial statehood. Then the sort of flip side of this development, however, was a new framework to legitimate the violation of that same sovereignty, including an international human rights order that frames rights as inhering principally in the individual and frames states as the principal violator of those rights, a pretext for intervention into the nation state similar to that of the League of Nations, but now unilateral rather than multilateral, and using new categories like failed and rogue states, and with collective rights and subjects nowhere to be seen. How did this all emerge at the same time? This simultaneous rise of a minimalist but absolute defense of postcolonial nation-state sovereignty, alongside new global norms that qualified that same sovereignty and so subjected those nation states to intervention.
One of the things the book argues is that there was always these two sides of anti-colonial internationalism, right? One, this more minimalist kind of defense of the states, of the sovereign state, and then these more kind of ambitious projects that either, wanted to delegate sovereignty to a regional authority or wanted, robust mechanisms of international economic regulation that would ensure equality, right? But so one of the places early that you see this emergence of a kind of defense of the state system is in Nkrumah's writings around the Congo, right? And around the resolutions that are passed in the United Nations around the Congo crisis, in the context in which the kind of Congo crisis has been transformed into a Cold War proxy war. So it's always there in some sense, but I think of these two developments as dialectical, right? As this anxiety, especially during the Cold War, of intervention and manipulation, are those anxieties are heightened, and as there's a series of crises internal or critiques and crises within this domestic context, securing and safeguarding these forms of external sovereignty become increasingly more important, right? But the second development that you talk about, which is this emergence of a kind of language of humanitarian intervention, is in some ways, we can trace the roots of it to the 1970s, where there's an emergence of what Sam Moyn has called a new language of human rights that's largely about human rights as individual rights that are above and beyond the state. That's already there in the 70s, but it's really only in the post-Cold War context that you see humanitarian intervention actually being articulated and practiced in a real way.
Because the fight against the Soviet Union was both a pretext for a lot of intervention, but also a check on it as well.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I think one of the things I point to near the end of the book is the ways that really beginning in the 70s, but certainly by the 1990s, the United States has emerged increasingly untethered from the international system, right? It created the UN system, right? But increasingly undermines international institutions like the UN and seeks to deploy other resources, say NATO or unilateralism in the 1990s and of course into the 2000s. And this is really the moment you see a birth of kind of humanitarian intervention. So for me, it's a sort of, and then of course in that period of increasing humanitarian intervention, it appears as if the only resource, and it's a limited one at best, is a kind of, we're trapped in the kind of insistence on state sovereignty as these increasingly new forms of intervention and new forms of unequal membership in the international order are introduced.
which goes a little bit of a way to explaining why both obviously imperialism is so unsettling, but also certain attacks on it can seem weird too.
Yes, like one doesn't want to be in a position of the defensive posture around state sovereignty can also be dangerous insofar as it does obscure real forms of domination in domestic societies.
And then the economic corollary to this whole shift from collective to the individual rights-bearing subject is global economic justice being conceived of in individual terms, which you write, quote, shifted attention to absolute poverty over relative inequality, and which we see today in just kind of like the mainstream development politics, the celebration of microlending and land titling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important development, and one you already begin to see in the 1970s. It's fully articulated in the 80s and 90s, but one that's much more concerned with a basic needs approach or on minimal standards of sufficiency over and above claims of equality. Now, I mean, as Sam Moyn puts it in his book, Human Rights in an Unequal World, I mean, what's interesting and important about this period is, of course, in some ways, yes, we have made actually important strides around the question of absolute poverty, but it's in a context, but in the same context, relative inequality has been magnified astronomically. So it's also this, a certain kind of minimalism that makes it impossible to think about, say, something like, what would a project of global equality look like in the contemporary moment? And so I think partly thinking back to these projects of anti-colonial world making, and especially the new international economic order, is also to remind us of the scale and ambition of the kinds of political projects anti-colonial nationalists imagined.
Your book isn't about climate change, obviously, but I found myself thinking about it constantly or reading it because climate change, of course, has been overwhelmingly caused by rich countries' emissions to create profits for fossil fuel companies, yet its impacts are going to be being most acutely felt by poor people in poor formerly colonial countries the world over. Any effort to deal with climate change by eliminating fossil fuels has to include internationalist redistribution at its core, or the between-nation inequality that fossil fuel development has already created will be locked in place. So my last question is, looking back, what do you think we might do going forward? How might what you call postcolonial cosmopolitanism be revived today? Because it seems like an incredibly important question that we don't have a lot of time to figure out.
I think in some ways the book is really concerned with a set of figures who lived, whose projects were emerged and thought between the 1940s and 70s, the 30 glorious years, the age of economic growth. And so in some ways, they too are embedded in a moment that's deeply tethered to the idea of growth as a kind of ongoing project. And it's one that, of course, we don't share as a horizon of possibility any longer. But I think one of the real lessons of their way of thinking about the world is to think exactly as you said about how it is that we think about the unequal integration of our world as the central premise and grounds from which we think an internationalist politics. How they're, say, in their account, the story of the ways in which the global South made the global North was the basis for them to claim a set of inclusion and incorporation in the growth, in the politics of economic growth, in the trajectory of economic growth in that period. And for us, I think that starting from that same premise can be the basis to make a different set of demands about who's going to bear the greatest burdens actually for transforming the situation or the context in which we find ourselves. Earlier this year, when Cyclone Idai hits southeastern Africa, in particular Mozambique, the hardest hit areas were just miles from an offshore oil exploration site, I think that ExxonMobil ran. And in that context, after the devastation of the cyclone, Exxon made a kind of donation towards supporting the recovery efforts. And activists on the ground were calling on Exxon to pay their climate debts. And so I think this language of debt has been deployed both in that context and by demands for reparations in the Caribbean to transform the question of who's indebted to who. It may be that the post-colonial world is indebted, owns debt, but by calling into question or illuminating the ways that, say, Exxon is actually indebted to Mozambique or in other places where it has drilled oil, is a way of circumventing that language of debt and calling on the burdens of climate change to be borne by those who have benefited the most. I mean, there's another, way I think we might think about this, and this is the work of Tendai Achiume, who's a law professor at UCLA, who's made this argument that if we also think of the kind of world as imperially integrated, we ought to think about the politics of migration and the ways in which migrants from the formerly colonized world move and travel into Europe or move from Central America to the United States as itself a process of decolonization, as an extension of the project of creating an egalitarian world order, and another way of calling into question what it is that the global North actually owes the global South. Now, I think you ask a harder question, which is like, what is the kind of
how to do it.
How to do it. And also just what would be the forms of solidarity, transnational and global solidarity that could reinforce and support these forms of politics, right? And I don't have a, straightforward answer there, but I do think just one more lesson, I think this is just for leftists in the United States to think about, or progressive people in the United States to think about, is this question of what and how we respond to the international crisis and international context of our condition is not just a matter of altruism. And it's not also a matter of solidarity that's like, we are also going to help our brethren out there. But it really, I think, is absolutely fundamental to whether or not we're able to transform our domestic conditions as well. So I'll just give one more example here, which is just to say, if one part of the climate is, transforming the conditions of climate change has to be tackling the question of military power in the United States. I mean, the US military is a huge consumer of fossil fuels, right? And so, I mean, here's a really important place, I think, where it's a question and issue that has both domestic and international reverberation. Curtailing and undermining US power, military power, calling for, a radical reduction of US military power has reverberations around climate change and about U.S. capacity to fuel international violence and conflict. It also has reverberations in the domestic context where deeper and deeper ties between military forces and police affect, marginalized and racialized U.S. citizens. So I think it's really about both a kind of an orientation, right? How when we approach a set of questions, how when we mobilize around a set of issues, might we bring this kind of orientation that thinks the domestic and international together simultaneously and always. And I think that creates lots of opportunities to think about the forms of coalition building that we might generate both domestically and transnationally.
Well, Adom Getachew, thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan.
Adom Getachew is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and the author of Worldmaking After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaled the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our senior advisor is Thea Rio-Francos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com and follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes or wherever, please consider leaving us a nice review. Those reviews ostensibly help put us in touch with new listeners, but what really truly does that is you telling other people how much you like the show. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to help keep this operation going strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.